Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, honored friends, it's an honor and a pleasure for me to welcome you here today. My name is Mark Donfried. I'm the director and founder of the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy. And I really look forward to the conference that we're about to begin. The ICD Annual Conference on Cultural Diplomacy in the USA. Options on the Table, Soft Power, Intercultural Dialogue, and the Future of U.S. Foreign Policy. Many of you may have seen we actually began this conference a few weeks ago in Berlin for the first part of the annual conference on cultural diplomacy, which was a fascinating event. We had the president of Burundi, we had a number of ministers, high-level academics from around the world, and it really gave a lot of insights into, I think, many transitions that we're observing in the field of cultural diplomacy. One of the things that I think we're going to address the next few days is really what cultural diplomacy means today, what it meant before, and what it might mean in the future. And I don't want to give a lecture now, but just in terms of a few words of welcome, the way I see the transition from the ICD point of view is cultural diplomacy of the past tended to be, how do we win the hearts and minds of foreign audiences? How do we attract? How do we make others like us? And I think even though Joseph Nye would argue that worked very well in the context of the Cold War, where you really had a bipolar world where it really was about convincing that one entire way of life was somehow more attractive than another. I think today the challenges are different. I think today, whether it's the U.S. foreign policy or any country, if it's just about attracting, if it's just about showing off, I don't think that's going to get us what we really need. I think what we need in today's interdependent world isn't so much persuasion, but it's trust. We don't need to necessarily like each other, even though it's good if we do. We don't necessarily need to agree with each other, although when we do is obviously helpful, but we do need to trust each other. Unless we have that trust, it's almost impossible to collaborate on anything, whether it's climate change, whether it's terrorism, whether it's poverty. So at the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, we really see what's essential for a sustainable relationship, whether it's between two cultures or groups living within the same city or the same country, or whether it's between groups living in different countries or different regions, is at the basis dialogue, understanding, and trust. So for the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy is really about just how do we educate, enhance, and sustain those relationships so that the trust can be there. We don't have to agree, we don't have to attract, we don't have to say we're great, or USA identity is like this, or German identity is like that, but we do need that trust. So really, as we talk about cultural diplomacy, I would argue in the coming years and generations, that would be where I would put the emphasis. Don't try to persuade or don't do propaganda. Just leave it. Don't even tell people what your country is, in the sense. Just give them opportunities to figure it out for themselves. Whether it's academic exchange, whether it's professional exchange, there are many options there. And then maybe just the final comments I'll leave you on, just to let you think about this a little bit. Our goal is really to stretch your minds these next 3 days, is to think about cultural diplomacy not so much about output, which it's been in the past. And when I say output, it's really, let's send our jazz musicians or let's present to you what our nation is about. But think about maybe a cultural diplomacy more about input, in the sense we need to listen more. The foreign minister of Mozambique once told us at an ICD conference, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, in the sense we need to listen more. And I think that's important for diplomacy and also cultural diplomacy. As we look at the Arab Spring, is one example. Many people wonder, why didn't the State Department see this coming? Why was everybody shocked by the Arab Spring? And I would say it's because the diplomacy and the cultural diplomacy was primarily about output, not input. We were busy making State Department Facebook pages and writing on Facebook pages. We weren't reading the Facebook pages. We weren't listening to the hip-hop music. We weren't watching the movies of Egypt. We weren't looking at the graffiti on the streets in Cairo. And if we had really had some sort of a cultural diplomacy which allowed for that input, first of all, we'd be better informed about the cultures. And secondly, I think even from a policy point of view, we might be better prepared for transitions that are coming all around the world. So just something to think about. It's kind of a radical idea for cultural diplomacy, in the sense that the State Department would pay to sort of, import cultural exchanges or listen more to other countries. But I would argue, I think that would really prepare the USA for the global context much better. There's an institution you may know that was present in Germany for many years in the Cold War called the America House, which is about really bringing American culture to Germany. And I don't want to criticize that. I think that played a very important role in the context of the Cold War. But they had a plaque on the front of the America House that said, "To tell America's story to the world." And even though that's a nice quote, I think today we really need to flip it and actually tell the world story to the United States. And I think that would really serve the United States much better. First of all, in terms of having a more humble approach, more about listening. Secondly, it'd make it much easier, I think, to build trust between not only nations, but in particular their peoples and their citizens. And over over the long term, because this is not something that can be done within a 4-year period or of any presidency, I think one can really build the understanding and trust that I think has been lacking, whether it's since 9/11 or the entire period that's followed. So just things to think about in terms of really stretching this definition of cultural diplomacy the next few days. I'm happy that we have really a wide variety of experts. This afternoon, one of our highlights, we have the Undersecretary of State herself, Undersecretary Sonnenschein. So that should be quite interesting now that Clinton is leaving, Kerry is coming. Her position is quite important. So you can ask the boss herself, so to speak, in terms of U.S. foreign policy, but also a number of academics from around the world, as well as policymakers. So I look forward to this chance. It's a fairly tight schedule, so we've asked speakers to give usually less than 20 minutes for the presentations themselves, so that we'll have at least 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers. I'd ask you in the questions to really don't be shy, in the sense, ask difficult questions, ask provocative questions, obviously in a respectful way, because you want to make sure the person really answers them, and try to keep them brief, and that will allow for as many voices to be heard as possible. So that's kind of my general advice. And also, again, don't forget to stay humble. Even if you're an expert in something, even if you've done your PhD in it, depending who the speaker is, I would encourage you, assume that you don't know anything. And when you ask the questions, really do so in a humble, respectful way, and I think you'll get more out of that. And I just say that because we have many cultures, many different nations, many different fields coming together. Sometimes that makes it easier.